Let me introduce myself. My name is Jing Augusto-Wuthrich. I come from the Philippines, and I just finished my master's studies here at the Bahal's University. And I did this presentation. It's a part of my thesis, and it's about animated documentary in Fulldome. Yeah. So basically, the talk will be divided into two parts. There's the discussion of animated documentary itself and how it evolved through the years, because it is very important to discuss these things, how it came about, and what are the criticisms about animated documentary. And the second part of the discussion, I will touch a little bit about why it has to be shown in full dome environment. And so with the term animated documentary, the first question that comes into mind is, what is actually animated documentary? Animated documentary is identified as the growing trend, which is using animation as a strategic representation of non-fiction work. Non-fiction works. A trend that has been developed since early 90s or 1990s. It is an audiovisual work produced digitally, filmed, or scratched or drawn directly on celluloid. Could be considered as animated documentary if it has been recorded frame by frame. And it is about the world or event that happened rather than a world or event that was invented or created by the filmmaker himself. And it has to be considered by the filmmaker himself as animated documentary. So if the intention, for example, my intention was to do a documentary, and I used animation as a method to present the documented facts of my film. The next one would be, I'm going to discuss, the reason why I have to discuss is historical diversification of documentary itself, because as I've said before, there's a lot of criticism that animated documentary is not actually documentary. They would always say it's docu-fiction, it's the most sincere form of docu-fiction, but actually it's not. So first, I would like to discuss the observational method in the 1950s and 60s, which is the cinema verite. It is an audiovisual, it is a movement which entails entailing the concept which is not staged, or no script has to be made, or the intervention of the filmmaker has to be kept at minimum level. Also, the concept presents that the camera is used to capture the truth, and it appears to be the most objective among these three that I will be mentioning. So, since cinema verite, they say, is the most objective, we have this already embedded tendency in our mind to go for this overt objectivity. And but the fact is, the filmmaker actually and ultimately shapes or refines the presentation of real life event that he or she has documented. And documented with the people, the event, and the world through the selection of the shots and arranging it. So it's not as objective as we would want to see it, because it has been, manipulated. The filmmaker has this tendency to cut the footages in an arrangement, whether it's linear or non-linear. So much for objectivity. The second one, it's the newsreel Kino Pravda type by Giga Veltov, which popped out in 1920s. Its vision was to capture fragments of actuality which, when organized together, would show a deeper truth. So it's always about this so-called truth, I mean, back then. And the Kino Pravda was done in a series of 23 newsreel type, and it was edited to show episodes showing the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. And apparently, there's no reenactment or staging, but in Kino Pravda number 8 edition, the man actually, if you've seen them, the man in the tram was actually Veltov himself playing this passenger. And the other crew members, which were the cameraman and his graphic artist, also played the role as, there were two people fighting and betting. So they played that role. So where is the objectivity in this? So if we are to be really overtly objective, I mean, some films are actually, I wouldn't say manipulated, but you know, it was subjected to the whims of the filmmaker himself or the editor of the film. And the last one, I made this one last because it's very important, the reenactment, which actually started in 1920s as evident in Robert Flaherty's film, Nanook of the North. He relived for the camera the lost tradition of the Inuit tribe by using harpoons instead of guns and using traditional clothes instead of the modern ones. It is, of course, staged or reenacted, but during the filming, the tribe already had been adopting the modern way of living. So when Robert Flaherty wanted to do a documentary about that, they don't have, they were not using these old weapons. They're using modern clothes. So he made them look like how they were back then. He also reconstructed an igloo to favor lightings and camera angles. So it's least likely that you would be able to shoot inside a film with, let's say, 4 people inside the igloo, plus the camera, plus the cameraman. And so I think he made a hole, or I don't know what he did. And just, you know, to be able to capture the things that were inside this igloo. But however staged or directed it is, his intention was to create a factual film to display this culture of vanishing tribe. And it sustains an interpretation of truth and the event and the world, or for example, the tribe as he sees it, as it originally was. So, so take note, reenactment. So let's go to the original definition of animated documentary. It actually popped up in 1926 when John Grierson wrote a review of Flaherty's work, which was, the title of the film was, I think, Moana, and one of them was this Nanook of the North. And his definition was, it's the creative treatment of actuality. This definition was too broad, that it provided too much leeway for interpretations, deconstructions, exclusions, and actually now reaffirmations, I mean, through time. But the thing was, cinema verite gained a solid clout in adding the term very, sorry. Where was I?
I hear voices.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Cinema verite gained a solid clout in injecting the term observational and objective. that we actually got used to this term overt objectivity. But in reality, these attributes were not in any way promoted by documentary itself. Actually, this exclusionary attitude against reenactment and the idealistic standpoint of, let's say, the purist stems from the infatuation of the cinema verite, overt objectivism. So the next question is, if we take this definition, the creative treatment of actuality, if we could reenact, why can't we animate? Well, basically, documentary is an objective gathering of facts. That's already a given, which results to the conception of, I would say, subjective narrative, because since I've mentioned before, everything has already been subjected inside the editing room, subjected to the whims of the film editor, to create a story, whether from A to Z or from Z to A, and some footages were even taken away. While animated documentary reenacts through animation, but does not claim to be real, but only a representation of the reality in an unreal way. So the question is, when do we animate? Well, the first logical answer would be, when do we animate? If you don't have a budget, you can animate. If you cannot, if you cannot gather actors, you can also have the option to animate. But I would say animation in a documentary is not emanating from the purpose of actually animating itself, but rather it is bound to the options of reconstruction to compensate for the limitations of, let's say, camera or the conventional live action thing. For my film, which is entitled S is for Episode, the focus of the animated narrative is the inner vision of the protagonist during her hallucinatory phase. But how important actually it is to show the film in a planetarium environment when it can be readily done in the normal flat screen or television or cinema. So in the planetary spaces were actually considered as venues of this type of films that provide an illusion of immersion, particularly for the subjects of that chronicle inner state of mind, psychosis or hallucinations, and mental issues. In a SIGRA, of course, even way back in 1995, Ed Lance proposed or said in his lecture that another possible storytelling device is to depict archetypes representing the character's conflict, inner conflict, or imagination. In other words, we would crawl into the character's head. And the immersive display allows room for simultaneous depiction of this reality and our inner archetypes. So even way back then, it was already projected that planetarium spaces would be the venue for this type of films. So the next one would be his sense presence thing. The purpose of deciding to show actually this film in the dome is not to undermine the already existing power of the television and cinema. There is, however, a very distinct attribute that the domes fulfill beyond experiencing the content information. It is called the sense of presence, and I think it is a derivative of the term telepresence, and it is defined as the subjective pleasure of being in an environment mediated by man-made technology, or basically virtual in nature. And it propels the spectator's perception that we are actually viewing, we are actually forgetting that we are watching the film inside a planetarium. And the next one will be there is some kind of stimulative or affective valence that immersive media provides. The spatial and oral resemblances of the events, mental or not. Our minds are receptive to this kind of visuals and oral cues, which are positioned in such a way that although it is so devoid of photographic references, for example in the animated documentary, it makes one feel that you are there experiencing this mental event yourself or with other people. And the next one will be the planetarium environment actually accommodates a more enhanced spectator experience through the 180 degrees immersive headroom, since it is free of discontinuity unlike television. I mean, however real they appear or photographic the images are, very filmic, but you're only limited to the left and right thing. But in the planetarium, you can turn around, and you know, when you hallucinate, it's not only left and right. It's up and down, front and back, midways, whatever. So what I did in the film was, the purpose of this film was actually not to portray a very technical, technical discussion of schizophrenia itself. It was aimed at understanding a person who is suffering from it based on her experience, the narrated experience. And the style of the oral narrative is inspired by, if you're familiar with Andy Glynn, who was the director, producer of the animated Minds. He has, I think, a series of this kind of films. They are animated documentaries, but he does always audio interview of the real protagonist with mental issues. And I did it on Blender 3D program. Actually, I was a beginner. I am still. And some of the footages I used were footages from, hi there, a 360 camera. And then I stylized it to make it look like it's animated, to make it look like a cartoon. And what did I forget? Oh, Pro Tools. That's what I use for the sound, assigning different sound effects from, in different positions in the dome, particularly. So, the concept of visualization, actually at the beginning, the intention was to do video interview with the protagonist, but she refused a lot of times, and so I resorted to the concept which the sole author of the book Animated Documentary, there was the concept saying the absenting the physical bodies, and the visualization concept is created in the context that everything is in the head, everything is above, the subject is not seen, basically because we are absenting the physical body, and the camera represents the subject. And for the audio concept, I had 6-session interview with the protagonist, and actually the whole time I interviewed her, she doesn't want she doesn't want to be filmed. She doesn't want the presence of any camera or cell phone. So I was just talking to her as a person, and then eventually at one point she said, okay, you can take a video recording of me speaking. And I recorded her, put the camera on, but she asked me to sit behind her. And I freaked out, actually. But you can ask me questions later. So anyway, so audio concept. I did some kind of, usually when we do animation, how do you call it? I lost it. Storyboard? No, storyboard, yes. Thank you. I owe you later. So, but since there's no presence of the protagonist, the priority now is the audio references that I recorded. So I made some kind of this thing they do in the radio, which is called the rundown sheet, wherein you divide the text. I actually wrote the text afterwards, so I divided it into rundown sheets. So it basically became some sort of a radio documentary, but as a reference, as the main reference, and then eventually I have to interpret this audio into visuals. So for example, in the film, if you would watch on Friday, you will see that there's a narration. She would say, in my own room, there's no better escape. Sometimes at night, I wake up feeling hot, as if the room was on fire. So you will hear this one. You will hear her voice when the narration is on, which is where I prioritize the voice of God. Top thing in the dome. And the second part is where you turn off the sound effects. Turn off the narration and put the sound effects instead of her voice. So, for example, when she said, I would start hearing a humming sound from behind the wall where the side of the headboard is. A mask or a head simulating the texture of the wallpaper pops up from there, breathing, humming. Its face is expressionless and would slowly move on top of me and would dive at me as if it was trying to suck me whole. So this one you won't hear her narrating, but I replaced her voice with, for example, breathing and humming. So that's how I balance the narration, because I don't want to make this mistake. Like, for example, in a common documentary, there's always this talking head all the time, and always the protagonist is always on camera, and people get bored actually with that. So since this project was done in Fulldome, I told myself, why not balance the narration and balance the audio effects and designate the sounds that she was describing in her interview in the dome, and distribute the visual audio effects, oral effects. So for the conclusion, animated documentary is not actually constrained to documentary is not actually constrained to the manifestation of events captured in filmic or photographic forms. When there are events, for example, if we go back in history, there are events that happen where the cameras are still not around. How would you make a documentary out of that? By going back in time or getting a time machine. No, it cannot happen. The option is actually to make an animated documentary. Second, I also would like to say that animated document, for example, if you want to make an animated documentary, you have to consider these options. For example, there are events that happen where camera, that's number one, where camera weren't present. The second one is the mental events. There's no way for a film camera to capture the mental events. If I am a schizophrenic person and you are all a documentarist, please stand up if you could film what's in my head. And the third one, there are some places actually that are where there are prohibitions. For example, prison cells, isolation, whatever. So you need to ask permission from that. Yeah, and there are actually film samples that showed where the protagonists are so far away or isolated, and then the filmmaker is in another place, and the only thing that they connect them was telephone interview, patched interview, and the filmmaker makes this audio as a reference to animate, to visualize. So sometimes, instead of seeing the protagonist becomes a vocalic body instead of a represented body. So in animated documentary, you can actually combine these three approaches. Either you want to do the cinema verite type, or you want to do newsreel type, or you want to do reenactment. Go ahead, make your day. So, because in the future there is broadening spectrum of planetarium films, and the attention might shift to, or already actually has been shifting to this kind of sense of presence thing in films. I mean, I'm seeing some kind of new genre like immersive journalism or immersive whatever, news reporting and stuff like that. And I was supposed to say something, but I forgot. Well, anyway, so that's about it, unless I need, yeah. So that's about it, and if you have any questions, please stand up.
So, any more comments from your side? Or does it inspire? Yes, Claire?
Did your protagonist see the movie? No.
She hasn't yet.
She hasn't
Not yet, until now.
Okay.
But her daughter saw it, and like, yeah, she said, you know, it was much better seen than being heard it on the dinner table every night.
Okay.
The story.
Okay.
Yeah.
But probably I'm going to meet her in 2 weeks. Yeah, in 2 weeks. So I might not. I don't know. I have mixed emotions actually,
Yeah.
because I don't know how it will affect her or.
Well, I think yes, it's very clear that, I mean, you've been so involved with that person and that person's history and story, and with the reimagining the inner world. But I think there is more to be considered about this, and that is, of course, basically we try to entertain, we try to show beauty or shock or awe or whatever, but there may be aspects of immersive media that move into the therapeutic realm or into therapeutic potential. And that is if we are invited to enter an immersion realm that is not our own mind. That can be very healthy to say, okay, there are actually other mental content than my own. That's that's a healthy perception. That's a healthy way of seeing the world, and it may or may not, but it may contribute to helping people get out of a certain limiting or conflicting mindset that they'd be happy to relieve. So, as I said in the beginning, our ambition is to how do we get people into immersion. But sometimes you are stuck in a certain kind of negative immersion, and you'd be very happy if you find an exit door to that. So people with schizophrenia, they know what this means to be stuck in immersion. And so this is why I'm really very thankful for the courage that you brought in sticking with her subject in the discussions. We know that it's not easy to find an approach, to find a language. In a way, it's the same when you mentioned the Nanook film. Mm-hmm. If you have a first contact with a tribe that has never been in touch with other worlds, how do you find a language? How do you find a respectful way of communicating to learn what is the world that you see and how do you see your world and how can I make myself understood in my world? So this is not just trivial mindfuck. This is basically how do we communicate with each other and respect outside the alienating factor of being different and separate. So I do hope that even if you maybe not like the film, but I think you will like the film, but it's confronting with something, the idea is to really consider what is the worldview that you travel in your mind, and what happens if it meets other worldviews, and how can this be a friendly contact and not domination or subjugation or any other evil stuff. So, yes, please.
One of the big issues or parts of making films is choosing the story.
Yes.
How did you choose her, and why did you decide? Film making is so hard. Yes. Why did you decide to embark on her journey and not any number of people's stories?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because way back, originally the plan was, we had this, if you remember, we had like 2 years ago, we had this Karl May thing, Winnetou 360, and while going through a lot of readings, I realized that Karl May has this multiple identity disorder. And I got so interested in that. And then when I presented the idea in the class, there were a lot of suggestions that, Karl May doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to be dealt with second-hand information, the descendants, yes. That's second-hand information, probably the family members or the ones related to him. That's already second-hand information. And it was also suggested that maybe you can find somebody else who has the same, or like in general has a mental issue, mental illness. Is it derogatory to say illness? So I veered away from that and then started looking for three mental issues. So I was targeting on somebody else with gender identity disorder, one schizophrenia, and one which was, I don't remember. But among the three, the daughter of the protagonist was actually replying to my email to everybody and saying that her mom is schizophrenia. But I am not sure if you would be able to interview her, because she has a term for it. And sometimes she's very communicative, sometimes no, and she doesn't trust so many people. That when I went there, she talks, but she has a lot of apprehensions that I might be somebody else who would, I know, probably kill her or attack her. So when I go to their place, I always leave my everything, my cell phone in my bag, and she doesn't want to see this kind of stuff. So I was just talking to her. So that's how I came into the option of taking her. And I actually almost gave up because I couldn't get footages. And time is running out for me on my thesis, so I said, no, I don't know what to do. But eventually, one day, she said, come over here, let's have some coffee. You can record just the voice. So I recorded her, and please sit at the back. So I was behind her, and the recorder was in front, and she was just talking and talking and talking and talking. But I already know the stories because within the 6 meetings that we have, or encounter, or coffee, she always says the same story over and over and over and over again. Yeah.
So I think your question is still relevant. You as producer choose what you want to do.
Yes.
And yes, there are certainly easier subjects to do. But I think it's your courage to choose a so-called difficult subject. But sometimes choosing a difficult project, you learn a lot. And I think we can learn a lot from watching the result of you choosing something a little bit difficult and also something very informative. Friday, watch a film, as is for episode. I thank you very much.
Any more questions?
Any more questions?
Or maybe later.
Or maybe later, she'll be around, you'll be around. And which brings us to our next presentation. First of all, a big round of applause.